Okay, so now we are recording this session, which is who decided which books belong in the canon. So I'm going to start with, actually putting up the slideshow. How about that? It looks better than this. Woo, there we go. Who decided which books belong in the canon? So the first question is to talk about what we mean by canon. I think we use it, but we may not exactly know where the word came from. So canon is from the Greek. That's it, the Greek letters that spell out canon, and that means reed or measuring stick. A measuring stick, you measure something. So figuratively, we use the word canon to mean a rule or standard. And in this particular case, it's the rule or standard of teachings that we use as Christians for a life of faith. The word came into use to refer to the sacred list of accepted books among Christians in the late 4th century. We've been using it ever since. So there's a couple, I think, there's some things behind this question, some feelings behind this question, some thoughts behind the question of where the scriptures that we have today came from. Since we hold these scriptures in such high esteem, we might wonder where they came from, because that might make us think differently about these scriptures. The Bible did not just drop out of heaven in this form. I don't know if you knew that, but no, the Bible didn't just drop out of heaven in the form we have today. And actually, there is a lot of other issues that could be discussed about how the Bible was written and translated and interpreted and all that kind of stuff that we're not even going to get into today. So in many different respects, the Bible as we have it now did not just drop out of heaven in this form. So many hands touched it and worked on it. And so that's important for us to know. At the same time, it was not a simple process of these scriptures just coming together easily. It happened both for the Old Testament and New Testament over a long period of time. And so I think these things are helpful for us to know as we approach the scriptures, especially when we know that there are those who interpret the scriptures they interpret them they kind of take it by word for word. I'm sorry, I'm tired. Word things aren't coming to my mind very easily. Literally is the word I'm looking for. So interpreting the Bible literally is not something that we as Lutherans do. And I think some of these, what we're going to find out about how the Bible is put together, are some of the reasons why we can't take it literally word for word. But we do hold the scriptures as inspired as instructive to our life of faith. So we hold the scriptures in high value. So we're going to start with the Old Testament, or also known as the Hebrew Scriptures. So the Hebrew Scriptures come from a time period that was a very ancient time. And so especially the very early books of the Hebrew Scriptures came at a time when oral tradition was used to communicate more so than writing things down. And so stories, especially probably the stories in Genesis and Exodus, maybe even the law itself, were shared by orally through the generations. Now, that's not to say that they could be inaccurate. I used to compare it to a game of telephone, where the old game of telephone, where you would start with an idea, whisper it into somebody else's ear, then they whisper that to somebody else's ear, and down the line, and then at the end you see if you get the same message at the end as at the beginning. But when you have a culture that uses oral tradition for their means of communication and storytelling, they're going to be good at remembering. They're going to that's going to be a skill that they're going to be able to remember the stories and be able to tell them through the generations. So keep that in mind when we talk about oral tradition and its role in the passing down of the stories of the Bible. So, but at the same time, that means that the writing down of much of the Old Testament would have happened after the events happened. So, and it could be many years, even centuries after the events happened, when writing was something that was more common in the society. So it's when you're talking about this, when you're talking about putting these scriptures together, I have to say you're going to find that different people have different ideas, thoughts about when the scriptures were actually became a fixed canon. And so this isn't an exact science. So there will be some who have different thoughts and ideas. In fact, my husband, Robert, had a pamphlet called How We Got the Bible. And I looked through that, and the dating in that is a dating that we wouldn't necessarily hold to. It's more, I guess you could call it traditional. So there are going to be different dates and different beliefs about when the scriptures were put together among different scholars, and then different denominations are going to hold to different dating systems. But I'm sharing with you what I'm pretty sure is what we hold to as Lutherans. So the Hebrew scriptures were likely put into a fixed canon by the 2nd century BCE. That would have been during the Greek, I think that was the Greek occupation of the Holy Land. So the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, appeared during or shortly after Israel's exile in Babylon. And that is understandable that at a time when the people were removed from everything that they knew, and removed from especially the temple and their religious practices, that might be a time when they would work really hard to try to gather and preserve, especially the law, the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, of the Hebrew scriptures, to preserve those, to make sure that they have those. And then that you can definitely serve for the people who are living in exile, can serve as something that unites them and continues to give them hope and faith when they are in a foreign land. In the prologue of the book of Sirach, which is also known as Ecclesiasticus, which are books of the Apocrypha, which we don't hold as part of our canon. However, they are historical books that record historical events, and that was written about 200 BCE. Sirach is said to have devoted himself to reading of the law and the prophets and the other books of our fathers. So this is something that shows that there was at that time a threefold division of books that were recognized. It was used obviously by Sirach in the around 200 BCE. So these are just some of the evidence that shows that the 2nd century BCE dating of the canon of the Old Testament or Hebrew scriptures. In the 160s BCE, the Maccabean revolt occurred, and it was because the ruling group, the Seleucids at that time, who were ruling according to the Greek ways and customs, had attempted to replace the Torah of the Jews with another law code in order to bring the Jews into in line with the other peoples that were under their rule. So copies of the Torah were taken at that time, and some of them were destroyed. But after the revolt against the Seleucids, Judas Maccabeus, quote, collected all the books that had been lost on account of the war that had come upon us, and they are in our possession. So that comes from 2 Maccabees chapter 2, verses 14. Again, not in our canon, accepted canon. However, it is historical. It is looked at as a historical document. And so this shows that the Jewish people during that time had scriptures that were considered to be sacred. Another piece of evidence is the Qumran community, also known as the Essenes. They were a group that went out into the wilderness because they didn't like what was happening. It was probably during this time of the revolt, and so they separated themselves in the desert to be able to continue to practice their faith. So, but that's the community where we hear about the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, the manuscripts had the books of the Old Testament, all except of the Book of Esther, and then other books, including Manual of Discipline, Damascus Document, Jubilees. Those are some examples. So they found all the manuscripts of all the books of the Bible except Esther, as in Qumran, and then they found these other books as well. So it shows that during that time they had all the books of the Old Testament were available. However, being that they had other books in addition, it's not clear whether this community had an established canon or whether they just had all of these writings, all of which they used. And then finally, Josephus, who was a historian from the late 1st century, wrote of the myriads of inconsistent books of the Greeks compared to the 22 of the Hebrew scriptures. And when he spoke of them, he divided them into 3 categories: 5 books of Moses, 13 books of the prophets, and 4 books containing hymns to God and precepts for the conduct of human life. So it seems as though definitely by the time of Josephus that there was a canon in place. But it's believed that most of the canon of the Old Testament was definitely in place in and around the 2nd century BCE. So that's the Old Testament. It seems like the Old Testament is a little bit harder to trace. So that's why there's so many questions about when the canon was actually put together. Of course, we do read in the Gospels references to, Jesus would make references to the prophet, a lot of times the prophet Isaiah, and they would make references to the law. You had a class of the scribes, you had the Pharisees, you had these religious leaders who were in charge of interpreting the law. So, and then there was rabbis who would study the law and the prophets. So by that time, since there were classes of religious leaders, there's a pretty good chance that they had a canon in place that they would then disseminate to, that they would teach, that they would enforce, and that they would disseminate to the people. But let's move now to the New Testament. And I want us, as we make the transition to thinking about the Old Testament, Hebrew scriptures, and the New Testament, to remember one important difference between the ways that these books of the Old and the New Testament were written. Remember that the books of the Old Testament, everything was written for the people of God, the community of people of God. It was for the Torah was mostly the law. It was to give God's people something to live by. You had the prophets, and the words of the prophets were supposed to guide the secular kings at the time, and the prophets also spoke the word of God to God's people at the time. So these were all directed to one particular community. It just so happens that when other empires came in, particularly the Babylonian Empire, and sent a lot of God's people into exile, then they were separated. They were scattered from each other. But the New Testament So for the most part, the Old Testament is written to a large community of God's people. The New Testament, on the other hand, is written to communities of faith that were definitely scattered. So we think about, first of all, the books of that were written by Paul. We call them books, but they're actually letters. Letters like Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, Philippians, and Colossians. These were communities of people who were located throughout Asia Minor and Greece, and then, of course, Europe with Rome. And these letters were written to those particular specific communities. So the letters went to those communities to be used by them, each of those communities, to address specific concerns or issues that those communities were dealing with. So the nature of these letters was already to be sent to scattered groups of people, and not the same letter was going to each church, to each group. When the Gospels were written, those were also written for communities with certain communities of believers in mind. One example is Luke and Acts, which at the beginning of each, the writer addresses this Theophilus, and the writer is giving an account of the life of Jesus for this whoever Theophilus is. So it is the Gospels are even sort of written for particular communities of people. Again, but not one whole group, but for different communities, which is why you have 4 different Gospels that are written differently from each other. Remember, Revelation was written to 7 churches: Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. So Revelation was intended to address issues of these 7 churches in these 7 places. And then other letters are written with a particular purpose in mind, usually to a particular community. So the New Testament was written with a different approach in mind than the Old Testament. These books were more scattered than the Old Testament books were, because the Christian communities, because the good news was getting out to different places and it was scattering. So the writings ended up scattered as well. But we have to remember that just like the Hebrew scriptures, the story of Jesus was originally shared through oral tradition, through speaking and hearing the stories. Now I'm talking about the stories that we find in the Gospels. Stories about Jesus were originally shared through oral tradition. But as time went on, when Jesus hadn't returned yet, and when the generation of original apostles were dying off, that's when believers thought it was necessary to write down these stories so that those could be preserved and shared with the generations of Christians to come. When the communities received letters, as I said before, Corinthians got their letter from Paul. The Galatians received a letter from Paul addressing their specific issues. Of course, those communities then used those letters in their teaching. However, when other believers, maybe evangelists or maybe just other leaders from other churches, might have visited these communities in different areas, they could then copy the letters so that they could take those letters back to their community. So that's how the letters, at least, could be shared with more than one church at a time, that they get copied and then shared with other churches in other places. But it's still understandable that some of these were really far apart. So maybe not all of the communities had all of the letters. Some of the communities might have had 1 or 2 or 3 letters. Some of the communities might have only had 1 because they were so far away from everybody else. So it really varied as to which communities had which documents. But it's a really interesting process then for how the canon would come together. So this is what I did. I went through and I found, again, some historical figures who made comments about who wrote about the scriptures and how, what scriptures they talked about. So that gives us an idea at that particular time when those scriptures, what the scriptures were being used for, and which letters or books were available at the time. So Justin Martyr lived between 100 and 165, and he wrote that Christians were regularly reading the writings of the memoirs of the apostles when they met. So the memoirs of the apostles would most likely refer to anything that they thought was connected to Peter, John. Of course, early beliefs were that and I'm going to get to that later actually, that the Gospels were all connected to an apostle. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were all written by one of the apostles, or somebody connected with Paul. So it's possible that Justin Martyr was talking about the gospel writings at that point. Also could have been talking about the letters from John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, 1st and 2nd Peter, those letters as well. By the time of Tertullian, which he lived from 155 to 240 CE, he was an early Christian author. Christians were regarding the Christian writings as equally authoritative to the Hebrew scriptures. Tertullian referred to 2 testaments that he referred to as divine scriptures. So that was in between 155 and 240 CE. So the canon is starting to get a little bit more, become a little bit more certain at that time. Clement of Alexandria, who was a Christian theologian and philosopher between 150 and 215 CE, he made reference to the New Testament in his writings. So again, it seems like there was some kind of something that was considered the New Testament, some group of writings, even though it's not certain what exactly they were. Now, Irenaeus, who lived in 130 to 202 CE, was known for combating heresy and trying to define orthodoxy. Orthodoxy means what doctrines and what beliefs are standard amongst everybody. What are the Christian beliefs? So, and there were some beliefs, and I'll get to that in a little bit, that were kind of going off into their own little world and straying from the core beliefs that came from originally from Jesus. So Irenaeus was working to try to work against those heresies. But there were some writings besides the Gospels that were available. So they had the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which, like I said, Irenaeus attributed them to the apostles and to companions of Paul. Apostles being Matthew and John. Mark and Luke were companions of Paul, and you can read that in the book of Acts. Scholars today don't really believe anymore that those books were written specifically by those people. They could have been written in those people's names by others who were associated with them. Which, as we said before, it doesn't mean that they were plagiarizing. It was common to write in the name of somebody whose name would have been more recognizable, especially if you were a follower of a disciple, if you will, of that person. So while some churches used other gospels besides these 4, Irenaeus and many other Christians regarded any other gospels but these 4 as fictional. That's where you get into your Gospel of Thomas and all that kind of stuff. I believe so. So it was a belief that there were some fictional gospels written at the time, but these are the 4 that that were most widely used. The letters of Paul, Peter, and John were available. And then there were others. The first letter of Clement of Rome from the end of the 1st century, a letter called the Shepherd, which was written by Hermas. a letter attributed to Barnabas. He was the one who worked with Paul for a while. And then a book known as the Diatessaron. It was read mostly in Syria, and it was a book by Tatian from the 2nd century who combined the 4 Gospels into one narrative. So he tried to harmonize all 4 Gospels into one story. But it was in 367 BCE when Athanasius, who was Bishop of Alexandria at the time, gives a list of 27 books to those under his authority. He released it in his Easter address. That list, it was the 27 books that we now have. It was approved by councils at Hippo in 393 and Carthage in 397. So this is basically the time when you have finally a canon that is established. So it was around this 4th century. But then in 1546, the 4th session of the Council of Trent, which was happening during the Reformation, acknowledged that all 27 books of the New Testament were to be accepted as sacred and canonical. So probably because of the Reformation and the division that happened, the Council of Trent was probably reformers who were saying, okay, but these 27 books of the New Testament are still our sacred writings and should still be accepted. Now, generally, there's something that moves us to do things like establishing a canon. I mean, I guess if everybody had been going along nicely in the, as Christian communities and just being Christians and worshiping God and living out the love of Jesus and all that kind of stuff, maybe we would have never had a canon. But just as the exile of God's people could have been a catalyst for gathering the Jewish law in a written form so that God's people had something to cling to, in a different sense, heresy can be a catalyst for developing a canon. When you have people who are kind of, like I said, going off and doing things that might not be considered very acceptable as far as you understand the teachings of Christ, then it feels like something needs to be done. So actually, some of the heresies of the day could have been catalysts for making sure that there was a standard, a canon of acceptable teachings of the Christian faith. So, and the problem was that some of the groups were accepting books that were not, as I said, they did not contain teaching that seemed consistent with what was considered orthodox at the time, and could reject certain parts of the Bible that were considered to be essential and part of the Orthodox teaching of the time. So the 3 heresies of the time were Marcionism, and Marcion was the one who rejected the entire Old Testament because he believed that the Old Testament God was an evil God, and the New Testament God was a different God who was a God of love and goodness. And Jesus represented the New Testament God, not the Old Testament God. So he basically separated out the Old Testament and any Jewish references found in the New Testament. And then whatever was left over is what he held as the canon. So Marcionism was rejected as heresy. Then there was Montanism. And Montanism was, there were people at that time who were getting into ecstatic religious experience and having inspiration to write other things. So they wanted to be able to include those other things as part of, part of their common teachings, which is really interesting to think that when the canon was put in place, it was basically, I forgot to turn the ringer off. Sorry about that. When the canon was put in place, it was basically a determination that these are the inspired writings. These are the inspired writings for Christians, and that's it. So, in other words, we're not going to allow for any other inspired writings after what we have here in the 27 books of the New Testament. So it's interesting. I'm sure we could read things that we believe are inspired today, but we wouldn't consider them scripture. So I don't know, just something to think about. So anyway, Montanism was believing that people were being inspired to write more things, and that those should be accepted and part of the tradition as well, but that was rejected as heresy. Gnosticism wanted to believed in a secret wisdom that you were supposed to have, that you needed to have. The Gnostics really associated most with the Gospel of John and the books, the letters from John. They believed there was a wisdom that you needed to have. Well, that's not Christian. It's about the Christian teaching is about the gospel being shared with all people. So there's no secret wisdom that only certain people have. So Gnosticism was rejected as heresy, but it was the desire to figure out what were the orthodox teachings, the standard teachings that all Christians would believe in and adhere to. And that goes back to the original definition of canon, a measuring stick. It was basically measuring what these are the standard Christian beliefs, and anything outside of this doesn't fit. Now, the New Testament books, you might wonder then, how did they decide which books would be part of the canon? So there are basically three ways that the books were decided upon. The first is how widespread the use of a book was, especially by theologians and bishops. So if the writing was used by a lot of churches, if it was quoted or spoken of by the most highly respected theologians and bishops of the day, that would be a book that would most likely end up in the canon. The second criteria was how closely tied to the apostles were the books. And Paul is obviously being counted as an apostle for this, because a lot of his letters ended up in the canon. But as I said originally, for a while, they were associating the Gospels with Matthew and John, Jesus' apostles, and then Luke and Mark, who were companions with Paul in his missionary journeys. And then, of course, Peter, First and Second Peter, First, Second, and Third John would be associated with those apostles. So that was another consideration for canonization of the books. The third was orthodoxy. As I said before, was the message of the writing consistent with the normative teachings among the most churches? So those books that seemed to be saying the same thing, teaching the same thing, were the books that ended up in the canon. So those are the three criteria that were used, which helped to put together what we have in front of us as the scriptures today. So I used some resources, New Interpreter's Bible Commentary. There's an article about the introduction to the canon, and I also used articles from BibleGateway.com online and Britannica.com online as well. I also used a book, Alta. I used a book from that you guys had gotten for your, I think your History of Christianity class. So, but only sparingly. There wasn't a whole lot in there about this topic. So that's what we have for how the canon was put together. And like I said, you're going to find that different people might have different ideas about how it was put together, the dating. Some will say that it was put together much earlier, just as they might say that the books themselves were written much earlier. But The archaeology is trying to piece things together, and those who study the writing and the style of writing are trying to put it within history when it would have made the most sense. So it's not an exact science, but this is one possible dating system. So with that, I am going to stop the let's see, I gotta stop the recording first. So